I'm going to talk specifically about the digital distribution process for the UFC. A lot of that particular workflow is actually affecting a lot of other things going on. Recently, the company purchased the LA Fitness gym, sorry, not LA Fitness, LA Boxing. They all have the same names. LA Boxing gyms. There's about 80 of those, and we're working on a distribution process to actually push video content to all of those gyms. So we're trying to work on some of that, and some of the lessons that we've learned in distribution for the UFC, for television, and for web, over the top, mobile, all those kinds of processes. We've learned many of those lessons already through UFC distribution, so we'll apply some of those to other distribution issues within the rest of our organization. So currently, this is a super simplified workflow. I'll get into some really complicated schematics here in a second of what our real distribution looks like. But just as an overview, essentially what we have is a live show that will take place pretty much anywhere in the world. Unlike a lot of the other sports like baseball or football or soccer as we call it here, we're not in a set group of venues that are the same that all the different sports share. So baseball teams all go from venue to venue to venue, and they're all doing the same thing and kind of shooting their sport in the same way. We're in a hockey arena one week, we're in a concert venue the following weekend, we're in a basketball arena the weekend after that, all of which have different, the swirly fun screens around the top of the arena. They all have different configurations for their large screen displays. And the really fun part for me is they all have completely different bandwidth availabilities inside of their buildings. So we can and cannot do certain things depending on where we go, and that is of course true country by country. But essentially what the content is a live show. We're doing video and audio ingest for an asset management system, for a live distribution on broadcast platforms, as well as every technology you can think of. And we're also trying to archive all those materials for editing to be redistributed as an edited product that's different than how it aired. So we're trying to do all of that at the same time. Another big piece of this that just gets more and more interesting with the advent of big data concepts and some of the other things that people are trying to do with social media is metadata is becoming sort of an ongoing challenge for us to figure out, which it's not just tagging, closed captioning, transcribing, understanding what was said, but it's marking up what's going on visually and trying to assign words to that. And that means a lot for social media, that means a lot for search down the road. It also helps us with a lot of anti-theft issues by tagging our video so completely. Metadata also includes images, the pictures that go along with a lot of distribution, because as you can imagine, almost any menu you've ever seen, there's usually some kind of image, some kind of title, some kind of description, some kind of price line. Every one of those elements has to be spelled out, and usually the content provider provides those materials. So we have to put all that packaged together with it. It also includes statistics. We keep massive amounts of and collect a huge amount of information. We're a sport. So just like all the rest of them, we've got how many times the guy hit the ground, how did the fight end, what were the techniques used throughout that fight, and all of that is synced with time code and kept as metadata as well. And last but not least, and really it's not even last, it's just kind of ongoing, is the actual distribution, the dissemination of all of that information, whether it's images, text, or video. Usually it's all three. We have to get that out of wherever we are to its final location. So I don't know how many of you can actually see this very well, but I tried to give an indication of about how much time each of those elements take now for us to do. And this is a massive improvement over how we did distribution via tape just a couple of years ago. Our current distribution system is primarily done, the asset management system offline is a product by a company called Levels Beyond out of Denver. And most of our tapeless workflow takes place as a combination of EVS efforts and some other compression technologies on site. Then we kind of continue the process back at our headquarters, which happen to be in Las Vegas. So we can take a dirty feed and a clean feed and get all of the ISO cams related to those all into our systems anywhere from about 36 hours to a week. And we typically choose what goes into the dam and what's ingested and tagged based on priority. What is it we have to distribute? Where does it have to go? Which languages have to be on those distributed items? Then we have various audio tracks that we record. Typically we do obviously English, but then almost every show now is done in Portuguese. We have a pretty rapidly expanding business in Brazil, so our Portuguese language is really in high demand right now. We also do a ton of content in Spanish and French, because our, middleweight champion is from Ottawa, and he has been for a very long time, so we have a really strong French following as well. Those languages are usually mixed off-site through a vendor, and then those materials are ingested into our dam after the fact. That's usually a week or so later. Closed captioning continues to be a really fun challenge. We are currently actually buying our own pay-per-views inside of our building and then using a piece of software to actually extract the captioning from the pay-per-view. And that is our closed captioning ingest process at the moment, which is interesting. And to get that cleaned up and actually synced back to the show time code takes about a week. We've actually started to do that just a little bit faster, but we're still trying to figure out how the heck we're going to do this in multiple languages and where that's going to come from. If any of you were at the closed captioning panel earlier this morning, several people were talking about how they tried to do various, machine transcriptions. They tried to have human beings in there with the foot pedals recording, but the problem is if you're pumping out as much content as we are worldwide, that doesn't scale unless you're going to, go buy a whole nother building and fill it full of people doing transcription. So we're still actually trying really hard to figure out how to solve that problem in a big way. We also capture a lot of statistical data. I alluded to that a little bit. That comes in waves because some of it is immediate and captured on site. It's great stuff for using a lot of mobile distribution, second screen or fan experience type applications. We use a ton of it, but it's verified over time. There are changes. There's judges. Sometimes the judging process and the commission process will actually officially come out with what they say the end of a fight was versus what was originally recorded. So we have to kind of keep up with that, and then that can take as long as 4 weeks before an individual state will get us back the final result of what they think happened in our fights. And then text metadata, really what I mean by that is logging. For those of you then in video for a long time, that's really just logging. What happened, what's on the tape, sync it to time code, then you know what's on your materials. And then photos, we have upwards of a couple of thousand official photos that are taken on event night, and we have a pretty technically savvy staff photographer who long ago figured out how to actually sync his camera clocks with our time and date time code in our live shows. So all of our photos actually are time and date time coded just like our video. So we've been able to figure out a way to store some of that and share some of the metadata between those two resources. That's been kind of an interesting challenge. So that is the huge overview of what it is we're capturing and what we're doing. This completely unreadable thing, I think probably for most of you, is the detailed schematic of how our material gets out of our live show across various pieces of equipment. So if any of you are interested in actually seeing this after the fact, I'd be more than happy to shoot this to you in an email or whatever, is a little easier to read. So essentially what we're trying to say there is up in the top left corner is the live event. Of course, we used an octagon because we put octagons on everything. We have an EVS process. That EVS, those EVS units, IP directors, all those kinds of products are actually shipped to each show. We have a separate unit that we built for international shows that just kind of go from external country to external country, and then a second unit set. They're both about 24 RU stacks that is colloquially referred to in our building as Alice for some unknown reason. And Alice goes to everything, goes to every show domestically. So what's happening is there's actually a lot of changes taking place in that stack now. We went from a tape-based workflow, which everybody did, to a tape-less workflow, which essentially means we're using the EVS process to transcribe or transcode all of our video live as it's being captured. We're dumping it to our mezzanine master that's in our DAM, which is a ProRes 422 file. And we're doing all the ISO cams live, the clean, the dirty, all those materials, straight to these pretty heavy-duty hard drives that we can carry around by hand. Because again, we're not sharing venues like a lot of other sports, so we have to carry everything in and out, in our pockets and in our suitcases on trains, planes, and automobiles. So everything has to be really, really mobile and portable for us. So all of that stuff is captured and then carried back. A very, very recent process, we're working with a company out of Boston called Zixi. We're actually going to start recording our streams live. And instead of storing them locally, we're going to take those streams and use the UDP process to store them in the cloud. So then the idea is we'll sync metadata to them and do all kinds of things to them in the cloud, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So right now, domestically and internationally, we're recording both our proxies and our mezzanines through an EVS process and storing them on hard drives and then walking them back to our headquarters. And that's when they enter our distribution system. In our main facility, we have, of course, a tape library, which is slowly but surely going away. We've just about captured everything. Another nice thing about being a brand new sport is that we only have about 34,000 hours of a total tape library, whereas I went and walked through Major League Baseball's facility on Monday, and they have well over a couple 100,000 hours with film that goes back to 1918 that they're still trying to figure out how to get various technologies that things have been recorded in over the years all into their system. All of mine took about 18 months to ingest, and I was done. So they're very jealous, but that's okay. We have telestream equipment. We have quantum equipment. Quantum is doing our LTO library storage. We have 4 of them in our facilities in Las Vegas. And we are at LTO 5, and we are trying to decide when and whether we actually skip a generation on LTOs to go to the next tape size. Everybody always has to go through that battle. When do you actually jump to the next LTO? We have replaced a big chunk of our spinning disk where a lot of activity took place with a RAM SAN, which now has a new name because IBM bought the Texas Memory Company, but it's a pretty cool piece of equipment. If any of you are struggling with any kind of SAN issues, I highly recommend you talk to the RAM SAN people, whatever their name is now. They have a really nice piece of equipment that moves very, very quickly. If you're doing a ton of I/O requests through the center of your DAM, their systems are screaming fast. It's a little on the expensive side, but it's gonna, I think, be functional in our workflow for a good 2.5 years, which is pretty good for a piece of hardware these days. We are a Final Cut and Avid house, although we are about a month away from switching all of our Final Cut people to Premiere. And our DAM is able to push out exports to any format anybody wants. We have chosen to be an agnostic export house so that editors, whatever system they're on, whatever they need, we can export that out. And what that's also led us to is not only can we export internally for editors to use to make other content, we also use the same DAM distribution process to distribute to all of our third parties. So instead of calling it an export, really there's just a name change and a slightly different UI in our distribution end of our DAM that allows you to push content in any format anybody could possibly need to all of our external parties, whether they're editing further, so they need a MES quality file, or if they're just taking a final delivery in their specific distribution format for the web or phones or OTT or whatever they're doing. We're doing all of that within the same export process in our DAM. So the bottom half of this tries to explain in a significant amount of detail how it is we actually do that external distribution process. Everybody has, names and acronyms for everything that they do. In our particular case, this external distribution process we call it a build order. So you can search for content, and again, that can be complete content, so an entire 30-minute show, 40-minute show, an entire 3-hour pay-per-view event, or it can be a single fight. You can search for the content within the system. We also have a partner profile setting. So when you go into the system, we have just about 200 external partners we deliver to every day. And every last one of them, of course, wants a different format. That's just life. So we have preset profiles for all of those people that says what format do they need, what's their metadata requirement, is it an API distribution, is it XML, do they need images, what are those image sizes, does it have to be squished together as a tar file and delivered, or can they be delivered individually? We do our very, very best to talk everyone out of FTP, and we tend to use Aspera deliveries just because it seems to get there. So all of those profile settings, all that stuff is all set up. The only material that we have to go outside of the system to export still is 25i. We just have not been able to find a software transcoding process that can actually create 25i that remotely passes any kind of viewing test. We have to do that via hardware, so we're still kind of having to hand walk those export processes through outside of this system. The other thing that we built into this that's kind of cool is we have 3 folks that actually do this distribution, none of whom are technical, and none of them are editors. They're people that understand how to write complete sentences and write good marketing copy. They do a lot of titles and description work, but they're actually able to go in, and if they're supposed to deliver a fight to somebody, they can go into this system, pull out the fight, and drop it on a user profile. And if that person happens to require an opening title, a closing title, lower thirds, plus a copyright statement, we've actually built that kind of a automated editing process into the delivery system. So nobody has to actually then go find an editor who can drop the beginning and the end and the lower third on it and then compress it out of their Avid or their Final Cut. We're actually doing that as part of the distribution process. So some of those simple things that you used to have to take away a very expensive editor to go do on the side, you can pretty much automate that process now. We've been doing it for about a year. The last piece we've got to tie into that is, of course, the closed captioning rules have changed again. So for an awful lot of content that was ever on television, which for our stuff is almost everything, we have to get closed captioning and provide it because we're the content owner, not a distributor. So it's our responsibility to actually deliver that closed captioning content as well. So the closed captioning battle goes on for us. The other thing that we've got in the back of this is that, of course, a lot of this footage is not used all the time. It's a one-off request. So for those of you that have spent some time dealing with asset management systems, one of the tough parts is if your content happens to be material that's captured over a relatively long period of time, 2, 3, 4 hours, these giant files, and if you try to put things into, everybody has different names for them, but kind of a spinning disk set and then kind of a deeper archive and then a really deep archive. The problem is if you need 2 minutes or 30 seconds or 5 minutes out of something that's 3 hours long, that's an incredibly inefficient, time-consuming way to pull back 3 hours of content from deep archive just to distribute 30 seconds or 2 minutes. So we've built in a process called PFR, Partial File Restore. It's a company out of the UK that's built it, and their name slips my mind, but it's a built-in extension to the Reach engine, which is the Levels Beyond company out of Denver. So what they can do is essentially go find a full 3-hour deep archive piece of material and actually retrieve only that 2 minutes or 30 seconds that you actually need instead of restoring the entire 3-hour file. It pretty much will cut down something that could potentially be a 45 to 50 minute wait time for something to come back from deep archive. It'll cut it down to about 5 to 6 minutes. So that makes a big difference as you're paying people by the hour to do editing. Then we have a file process or processing set. If it's going to Avid, obviously it needs MXF. If it's going to Final Cut, it can stay in native ProRes. If it's going to something else, it's got to make those formats. So that processing takes place. It'll also try to sync metadata. We have a completely separate metadata publishing system that we ended up building ourselves because I couldn't find a good solution. That was done with a company out of San Antonio called the Denim Group. And they're actually the folks that built the back end of our CMS, our website CMS. And we had them build our metadata publisher as an addendum to that CMS, because what we realized is that most of the time what we're doing is delivering content to a third party that we've already talked about on UFC.com. So there's kind of no reason to make somebody rewrite or reinvent titles and descriptions and air dates and times when all of that stuff really, the first time it appears in the workflow is on UFC.com in the form of a schedule announcement. Worldwide, this is true. So we have a metadata publisher, and I believe I brought something to talk some more about that. Finally, there's a new process we've put in, which probably seems amazing that this is new, but for us it is. We have an approval process. We had such a small staff for so long that was so integrated that you turned around and yelled at somebody if you need somebody to review before you distributed something. We now have offices in London, Tokyo, Rio, somewhere in China. We have 6 editors in our LA office now that do all Spanish content, and a bunch of folks in Toronto. So nobody can just yell over their shoulder anymore to find out if it's okay to send somebody something or other. So we've actually had to build in an approval process to allow not only our own folks to make sure they have sign off before they distribute something that gets a contract, but they can, we can now allow third-party editors, so post houses, if you will, that we hire to do various special programming. They can actually just log into our DAM now through a regular web UI, request and find their own content, goes through an approval process before then it's automatically delivered to their Aspera, or a couple folks have Signiant, their final delivery point. That is what all that says. So this is kind of a side issue, but a lot of you will kind of see this problem start to creep into your world. We are kind of a little bit of a unique company in that we are the content owner, but we're also self-distributing. Almost nobody else does that. You know, if you're NBC or CBS or you're baseball or football, almost all of them have a middle company that actually handles things like redistribution rights or selling them to another rights region by region across the world, or selling digital rights that are different from television rights. And that means you're usually delivering different things against each of those rights. We've actually done all of that ourselves, which has good and bad consequences, of course. So what we've had to try to figure out is that part of the process that talks about distribution and how do you keep track of who has the rights to do what. So we use a company out of Los Angeles called RightsLine, and what they've done is they've looked at our worldwide media contracts and tried to extract from the legalese the data points that are in each of those contracts and put it in a database in such a way that one computer system storing one kind of data can check against this data to make sure we're delivering what we're supposed to, when we're supposed to, and not more than we're supposed to. So the part that took the longest time, of course, was translating legalese to computer. That took a while. But we finally got it figured out. So we have all of our worldwide contracts all in one system, and they say things like, we've kind of come up with a product assigning process, so a unique ID for each product. We've also done some research with an effort that's been going on out of LA for a couple years called the IDER system. I don't know if many of you have heard of that, but it's the Entertainment ID Registry, I think. it's a very Hollywood-centric thing because the entertainment industry is trying to figure out a way to keep a unique ID intact across not only their internal distribution systems, but TV schedule guides worldwide. Because really what we're doing when you're distributing metadata is you're saying the same thing over and over and over again across all these different systems just to say, here's the title of my show, here's a description, watch it. So Hollywood, of course, has to redistribute their movies and their shows over and over and over again in so many places. They had to come up with some kind of way to uniquely identify their content, whether it's on a TV guide, in a distribution system, in a theft prevention or theft logging process. They're trying, this IDER system is trying to track content, each individual show, against those numbers everywhere in the world. So we're part of that process, and it's actually been working pretty well. So we're using that IDER information to then track material as it hits the dam. So the process we just talked about with distribution is actually also referencing that same IDER number, which is referenced in the contract and then is referenced to the media itself. So we're able to kind of track it not only through our whole system, but then as it's distributed throughout the world. And I think that's actually going to become more and more important as an aside for theft prevention, as there's more and more of us that are losing, we know, many, many, many thousands of streams every time we do anything live, let alone re-recorded. There's just really not a good, efficient way to track our losses, let alone take those materials down. So I think there's going to be probably a lot more development work done by larger groups to kind of figure out how else that IDER number can be used along those lines. We also then track, so once it's through the dam, there's media processing, so that's all the delivery. The next piece we do is metadata publishing. So those are typically either API or XML deliveries that have tons of text, usually information, that a third party requires. So if we're delivering a fight to a Verizon video distribution system, or we're delivering to a Roku box, or we're delivering to Xbox's media center, we have to provide them with all of the metadata that allows you to find that programming within their third-party distribution system. So we actually carry that IDER number again through that metadata process. Even though still probably 90% of them ignore that number today, we see that growing all the time. People are now asking for and ingesting that IDER number, those unique IDs. So we have a metadata publishing system that will allow us to scale, grab photos that we store back in our website CMS, as well as our ART digital asset management system. This system will actually allow the person publishing the metadata to search through all of those photos, pull it into the system, crop them to the right size that's required by the third party. So they don't have to, those folks that are there don't have to understand what format any of these photos are in or any of that stuff. They're essentially, their skill is marketing, to understand how to talk about this content in a way that's going to sell it on whatever platform it ends on. Then they don't have to understand the technicalities of how do you create a video and put it in the right format, how do you create a photo and put it in the right format, they just open a crop screen and grab their stuff, and all of the well, it's not transcription, I keep saying transcription. The changing of that media into whatever its final format needs to be is all happening behind the scenes, so the person actually doing the order processing doesn't have to understand 15 different pieces of software in order to get that stuff out the door. And then the final piece that we're really trying to handle is reporting. There's a element to this that it's one of those gotchas that'll come towards the end of an asset management development process, which is, for those of you who had tape-based systems, you might remember Nesbit or some other system like that that was your way of tracking tapes. That goes away when you're file-based. And then suddenly you're doing a whole lot of distribution with really no way to tell your accounting department, did the tape go out the door? Did somebody receive it? Was it ingested? Did they download it? You know, you have a contract that says we were required to deliver 50 shows, and you just kind of have to go like this because you really don't know. There's no tracking mechanism without a physical tape to figure out if the file actually got there. So we've had to figure out how to have a file-based asset delivery system report back what it actually delivered. And again, we've ended up taking some of that ITER information to try to use that in a way to help us understand that we've sent the same content to 15 places because the title requirements for all 15 of those places were different. You know, if I'm sending to a mobile phone, my title can only be 19 characters. If I'm sending to an OTT box, my limit's probably 100 characters. If I'm sending to television, I don't really have a limit because they never show that anyway. So then if I hand this whole list to accounting and tell them, okay, here's the list, they have no idea which of these things is really the exact same content. So it's just kind of another one of those fun little challenges is figuring out how to actually report what you've delivered out of a thing that doesn't deliver physical content. So this is the Metadata Publisher. This is, we ended up having to build it from scratch, and I mentioned previously that we kind of decided that the thing that made the most sense was to put this Metadata Publisher in the process where it could pull data from our website, CMS, because that's the place we often talk about this content first in the form of a TV schedule. Here's what's coming up. Here's the UFC content that's on in Sweden this month. That's the first time we talk about it, so rather than write all that over again, we might as well just port that data into a Metadata Publisher. So we have tons of third-party required text, and some of that is different languages, but mostly it's required numbers of characters. So we've built in a process that's, I'm sure is familiar to all of you. When you start typing in, it starts counting down how many characters you have left to make sure you fill those titles appropriately. We can pull images, and as I mentioned, we can crop them and take care of them ourselves, and then we can export XMLs, APIs, tar files, and there's one more that I've now forgotten. That's another compilation zip files, hello. Somebody will always require a zip file. So this piece, this last piece of these exports actually ties in directly with our digital asset management system. Meaning if you're creating a tar file, just for those of you that don't necessarily know what they are, a tar file is essentially kind of like a zip in that it's a folder that makes you put your video assets, your image assets, and your XML all in this file that's been specially formatted. Then it also includes this funny little extra file that essentially says, yes, all the files are there. So you put this in a tar file, and then the entire piece gets delivered, and the third party usually won't take any delivery until the whole package is there and all together. Then they move it into their sphere. So we're able to, we actually had Denim Group in San Antonio and Levels Beyond in Denver work together to figure out how to combine their delivery process in order to get this final distribution out the door. So here's the fun part. I get this question a lot because I've done a lot of work to try to actually expand our distribution process without buying any more hardware. One of the things that's interesting about trying to run a company that's fairly technology-based in the desert is that we have 6 months of year or more where it's well over 100 degrees. It's not uncommon to hit 115 several times between June and September. So trying to have a whole bunch of servers and keep them cool in the desert is really, really expensive, let alone the humans. So I am a big proponent of, I have become a big proponent of cloud technologies. I'm looking at encoding systems. I believe it's both Telestream and a company that's showing here called Elemental is talking about releasing things like encoders that can take a certain amount of jobs and a certain amount of work, and as soon as it hits the threshold where it's maxing out, it actually pops those next jobs to their cloud to hit that peak of too much stuff to do, and then come back down and turn off those instances and keep running on your local hardware. So for us, because we're so event-driven, that's a fantastic solution, because then I don't have to have so much hardware sitting in this building in the middle of the desert, I can pop a lot of those expanded jobs to the cloud. So that makes a really big difference, I think, for us as those materials actually start to be really, truly useful into next year. That kind of technology expansion is going to make a big difference to us. Then there's this social media thing. We've got to figure out, I'm sure many of you went to presentations today where everybody kind of keeps referencing the Twitter thing and the Facebook thing and having these feeds and all that stuff. What's happening on the distribution end is we're starting to see people asking for some of those deliveries with the video files. In other words, treating social media conversations as metadata that goes with a replay, which is really interesting to me. We're just really kind of seeing people talk about it. But if you've got companies out there like the Radian 6s of the world that can capture massive amounts of data around what happened, and I think it was the CBS guy this morning was talking about how they'll replay the social media feed when you go back to watch a show that replayed the night before. They're capturing that material and delivering that social media along the timeline as if it were playing then. So we're starting to see some of that happen a little bit with some of our replay stuff. Figure out how to turn something that's happening out there in the world that we don't have any control over, figure out some way to capture it and then re-deliver it with a product is really going to be pretty interesting. But again, it's not necessarily something I want to buy a bunch of servers and processes and hardware to deal with inside of my building. I want to figure out ways that I can scale this and do this in the cloud, especially because a lot of those deliveries are going to be in formats that don't really require a full ProRes MES file. I can, what we're doing with the Zixi guys is we're actually sending a full, our proxy is now going to be a full 1080 proxy, which means almost anything from a phone distribution to an awful lot of compressed files for the Hulus of the world. I'm perfectly able to take that and create that file from the mezzanine that's actually sitting in the cloud, which isn't really the mezzanine, it's kind of the mezzanine. It's just a really good proxy. The point is, why would I bring all this stuff back down to the ground and use all our hardware on the ground to process that when if I've got a decent enough proxy sitting in the cloud, do the encoding in the cloud, do the delivery in the cloud, keep it all up there and out of my building to keep the resources that are on the ground for things that still can't be done in the cloud, like cable labs compliant video deliveries. You still can't do those in the cloud. You can't do 25i in the cloud. You can do almost everything else in the cloud, but those things are big, they're heavy, they take time. You want to have hardware on the ground to deal with that and send everything else out. So I think I'm almost out of time here, so I'll just quickly go through the end of this, which is our stream to store workflow. So what we're trying to do, as I mentioned in detail before, is we're capturing and encoding all of our materials live on our venue floor, sending them all to hard drives, and then taking them back with us. That process takes about 36 hours. What we're actually just in the process of starting to do now is stream to store, meaning we're going to try to capture our clean and dirty feeds live at the venue and actually use a technology out of Boston called Zixi to compress those files and deliver them directly to our Amazon S3 storage and make sure that there's no packet loss, make sure the time code stays intact so that we can also sync live logging, otherwise known as metadata, and create a proxy all at the same time, stream all of that stuff directly to Amazon's S3, and then essentially what that means is editors would be able to access that stuff within about 20 minutes of the show starting. And considering our full production day is a 6-hour day, we usually do 12 fights. That means very much earlier on in the day, editors can start chopping up highlights. They can start pulling out materials that we can send to our fan experience app. So I'm not traveling these folks anymore. These guys are sitting in our headquarters or at their house or wherever they are, whatever country it is, editing in whatever language they speak. They can pull these mezzanine quality files down into their editors, create highlights, and push them to mobile experiences, push them to second screen experiences, push them as highlights to local news programs, whatever it is that we need to do that's just going to be just good enough to be able to address a lot of those issues. So that's not 36 hours later, that's while the show is going on. And that makes a huge difference, of course, if you're trying to do a live production. So that's essentially the next phase for us, is to try to move these pieces and parts that are all taking place in different places and saved and then merged back together several hours later. We're trying to do it all live in the cloud so that we can start accessing that stuff within minutes of the show starting instead of 2 or 3 days later. So just really quickly, the social media effects on MAMs are kind of interesting, and I've covered a little bit of this process, but here's some things to think about. You kind of need to look at how fast your production department can actually deal with video in order to feed the social media maw that is this endless process. These things are all pretty important to consider, because if it takes, you get a file in from a group that shoots, and then they have to log it, and then somebody does a rough cut, and then somebody does the final cut, and then you can finally distribute this thing. That's maybe a 6, 7, 8 hour process if everybody's moving really, really fast. The average shelf life of a social media piece of video, while it's incredibly effective, 60% of people, Forbes just did a research study on this, 60% of the people that use social media on a mobile device will click on a video and watch it before they'll even read the text that goes with that video. I found that astounding. But your shelf life for that is about 90 minutes. So if you've got a 6-hour production process and a 90-minute effective window, that math isn't going to work very well. So some of the things that being able to put video quickly into the cloud, pull video from more sources like cell phones and some other things like that, and get all that content in one location in the cloud, means that potentially you could be churning through content a whole lot quicker, which makes it pencil out basically better in order to feed a social media video workflow. So that's a project I'm working on the side, and I can talk more about that later, but that's pretty much it. It's exactly 12:30. So if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them, but I know there's food happening downstairs, so you all can run away if you want to.